Very special thanks once again to My Next Car in Bedfordshire for providing the vehicle in this review. As always, I've linked to their website and current stock down in the video description, and it's always a pleasure to work with them, so if you are in the Bedfordshire area, I can strongly recommend checking them out. It could easily be a daunting prospect to review a car as iconic as this one. An A80 Supra in pretty much any form is going to have its fans, but when it's an immaculate, original, completely stock 1995 right-hand drive model, which is not only untuned, but also has less than 20,000 miles on the clock, well, you kind of are driving automotive royalty. At least when it comes to the JDM market, it's a legendary import, of course, no matter what country you're in. It tends to have, let's just say, a pretty healthy following. It's something of an internet darling as well, being a meme car, a borderline deity of the petrolhead world. And even though, yes, this one, as you can see in some of the shots, is of course the automatic, not the manual, don't let that put you off, because the points that I have to make about the Supra are actually kind of irrelevant of the gearbox, so stick with me there and just hear me out. Because when I review a vehicle, something as iconic as this one, or even some brand new Lexus or an Aston or a Beamer, the parameters of what make a car good or bad in the real world actually don't change as much as you'd think, because it's all well and good having something that you can boast about over a pint at the local pub. Bragging rights are a great thing when it comes to a sports car or a supercar, but actually using that car on a daily basis, that can kind of separate the posers from the actual greatness. And that is something which I love to experience in these cars that I review, because we already know the spec, especially many of you here on the channel, because as I've said before, I'm one of the relatively few channels on YouTube to talk about these iconic cars in real life and in racing games on the same channel. So it puts me in a relatively unique position of having cars that I've sometimes grown up with. Certainly when it comes to the Supra in Gran Turismo in particular, it's one of the hero cars of the franchise, and then driving a real one. So of course, even if you're not a super fan of the car, for instance me, I don't consider myself a Supra fanboy, I consider it similar to the Skyline, or the GTR in general, wherein I have a huge amount of respect for it. I think it's an excellent car, but I wouldn't necessarily put it in like a top 10 personal favourites. But bear with me, because even though the heckles on the back of your neck might stand up if you are a Supra fanboy, and I can totally understand that, I'm actually not going to be bashing on this car, because there tends to be two camps when it comes to the Supra. There's the camp which is about 90% of people, which is that it is a basically god-tier vehicle with the incredible 2JZ engine, insane tuning potential that can beat everything straight out of the box. That's the 12-year-old mentality. No matter what car you're up against, the Supra will win. It's basically the Batman of cars. However, there is another camp, a camp of people who believe, almost as a pushback to the first camp, that it's an overrated car, that maybe it's not deserving of that reputation. That is where I want to fall, somewhere between the two, to consider, is it a great car? Why is it or isn't it? And what's it actually like to drive it in real life, on the street, not just on Trial Mountain in Gran Turismo 3, or whatever the case may be. So how does it feel in real life? And crucially, should you actually buy a Supra? And if you do, should it be a stock one? Should it be a pre-tuned, aftermarket, professionally tuned one, like, some top secret Supra or something? What kind of choice should you make? Well, first things first, let's talk practicality. It's probably not the place that you expected me to go first with this review, but I'm going to, because I think it's important. Yes, it's fast. We know that, and I'm going to get to that in a second. What impressed me first of all about the Supra, though, is actually how comfortable and spacious it is. And that, for a two-door sports car, is kind of a big deal. It's not the kind of thing that many people will even think about, especially younger viewers, but trust me, if you buy a car with a very significant amount of money and want to use it beyond once a year and then need a chiropractor after every time you use the car, then it kind of needs to be comfortable. You need to have at least enough headroom so that you don't have a crick in your neck every time you get out of it, because as cool as the car might look, you getting out looking like Uncle Fester doesn't. So the car having that kind of space, that kind of comfort, is a very important thing. It impressed me, and the reason why it impressed me is because I didn't even notice how much space the car had until I was done using it. That is a very impressive thing to me. If I don't even notice the headroom, or the width room, or the legroom, well, that's only a good sign. And the Supra definitely impressed me in that regard. In terms of the comfort, I will say that the ride quality is definitely on the harder side, being as it is, of course, a sports car, not something like a big luxury Mercedes or an SUV, so of course it is going to be harsher. The payoff to that, though, is of course it's so much sharper and better through corners than something like a sedan or an SUV, even a high-performance one, would be. How does the car's performance and handling and acceleration compare to a modern car, though? Let's actually talk about some of that stuff. Yes, it has that iconic 2JZ engine, of course, over 320 horses, a sequential turbo setup, which is one of my favourite things about the car, actually, because it gives you this feeling of acceleration which is very surprising, actually, if you haven't driven a Supra before, because usually with turbos, especially older ones, 80s and 90s, they're known for their lag. You put your foot down, you wait a few months, and then the car accelerates. This doesn't do that. In fact, the acceleration is very good, even by today's standards. Once again, this is a stock car. But get a load of these numbers. 320 horsepower, rear-wheel drive, about 3,500 pounds, so it's no lightweight either, and with the manual gearbox in particular, it can do 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. That is insanely quick by today's standards. That's impressive, let alone in the early 90s to mid-90s. That is really good, and it doesn't even have the all-wheel drive advantage off the line that something like, for instance, a GTR would have. Another impressive thing about this Supra, even compared to the newer one, is actually the top speed. Both of them are kind of similar. In their stock form, they can both do around 160 miles an hour. In fact, Car and Driver took a Supra of this generation to 160 miles an hour in a test. And again, that's stock. At the time, that's pretty much Porsche territory. Now these days, you're also looking at, in some cases, a Porsche price. This car, for instance, is just under 50 grand. So in other words, the same kind of money as a 2019 very low mileage A80 Supra. That is another interesting question, because even though this isn't a rival showdown, it's still a question that needs to be asked, especially if you're a slightly older viewer, not just a kid watching it because it's a cool car and it's fast and, brum brum, this is cool, but if you're actually thinking of buying something, the crucial question is, should you go with your childhood and buy this legendary car that seems like a great investment and that you could potentially use every day? And we're going to get to that, that's why it's in the thumbnail. Or should you buy the latest version, the updated, newer chassis, newer engine, more efficiency, better performance? The newer car is quicker. Which one should you go for? Well, I think that there is a very strong all-round argument that you can make for both, and they are simultaneously so similar but so different. They're both Supras, so of course they're going to be similar in some ways, but for instance, the older car is longer than the new Supra. This is 5 inches longer than the new car. However, it's also narrower. The weight is pretty high on both for what they are, a 2-door, 2+2 in this case. I will say though, as far as that practicality goes, the rear seats aren't exactly spacious. Douglas Bader might get in there, but anything beyond like a toddler, you're going to have trouble. It's also, of course, a hatchback, which gives you a little bit of extra room to play with in the trunk. But in terms of practicality, most people aren't going to be going to a Supra, first of all, for that kind of argument. However, what I will say about it, and this is something else that impressed me, is that even in the time that I spent with the car, I could immediately tell that actually, yes, this is a car that you could genuinely use every day. And that is something which I think you can't say about a lot of highly collectible classic to semi-classic cars. Some of them, as beautiful as they are, as collectible as they are, as insanely valuable as they can be, you just can't use them every day anymore. Fuel prices, awful handling, terrible suspension, a variety of reasons, maybe just unreliable nature of certain cars. This ticks every box, and that is coming from a not Supra fanboy. So you can take it as being even more honest, because it's not like I come into this argument with, a bias toward the Supra. I don't by any stretch. In fact, many people hate to hear this, but I'm probably more of a Skyline guy, actually, maybe R33 or R34. So if I can still admit that about a Supra, well, that kind of tells you something about the machine. What I will say is that if you're trying to decide, for instance, between an old Supra or a new Supra for that same kind of price, there is a certain charm that the older car has, which I can definitely say it lives up to. Now, a tuned one, I don't think will. You know, some garish body kit and a stupid wing and ridiculous decals. It does it for some people, it really doesn't for me, and it doesn't do it for the market either, because you can pick up a tuned Supra for like 10 grand, this one's 50. So the values speak for themselves, and that's a topic which I've actually talked about on other occasions. Something which is more personalised, you know, even like a luxury car like a Rolls or a Maybach, people don't want to pay that kind of money for a car that somebody else spec'd up. And the same thing applies to a modified car. No two people will love those modifications as much as the original guy did who tuned it. Whereas if you find something that's stock, that's completely original, well then you can either put your own mark on it or you can just enjoy it for what Toyota developed it as. And I think that in this case, there is a lot to love, because I was actually surprised by how much I liked the car. Because I'll be honest with you, I went into driving this vehicle with something of an idea of what to expect. I thought I knew what I was getting into. It's a large, powerful, certainly by 90s standards, quick in a relative sense, but maybe a vehicle that's starting to feel its age. Maybe something that doesn't deserve to be quite as iconic as it is. Maybe a little bit creaky, a little bit rattly, maybe a little bit long in the tooth. Maybe it feels like a 1995 car. What I can very happily confirm is that it actually doesn't. This car has aged really well, and that impressed me, and it actually made me very happy about the car, because I kind of get it. I get why people like the Supra so much, certainly people who own them, and who have driven them, not just, you know, played racing games. I can safely say it does live up to a lot of what you would hope the Supra would be good for. Not just the performance, not just the power, of course the looks and the sound, depending on how you tune it or if you don't tune it, but also stuff like how spacious it is, how comfortable it is, how usable it genuinely feels on the street. And as I've mentioned in this series before, and it's said a lot about cars and motorcycles, people say don't drive your heroes, don't meet your heroes, because more often than not, they will let you down, because you place these cars on a pedestal that they can't attain. Now, for somebody who overhypes the Supra and then drives one, maybe you could be disappointed by something, but for me, going into it with a lot of respect more than love, I definitely wasn't disappointed in any way. In fact, in some ways, I like this one more than the new Supra. I think it's definitely a prettier car. Of course, it's of its time, but that's a personal opinion kind of thing. In terms of the size, it is larger in terms of length, and even the interior. The newer Supra has a nicer feel to it, you know, the details, the smaller things, but the way the display and the cockpit kind of wraps around you, almost like in more recent times a C7 Corvette Stingray does. I'm a huge fan of that. I love cars that have that wraparound display around the driver. It makes it feel cozy. It's a nice place to be. The Supra is very flash from the outside, we already know that. From the inside though, it's a nice place to sit. It feels welcoming, it feels homely, and one of the things that I loved about it as well is as soon as you start driving it, and I've noticed that this changes with every car that I review, be it, you know, something like an Aston, my own cars, the Maserati, the Touareg, whatever. Each car takes a certain amount of time to get used to. Certain vehicles you feel like a passenger, like the car's doing all the work and you're kind of unnecessary. Then you have other cars that feel like they want to play all the time. Some cars feel maybe a little bit underwhelming. Others are really cool and surprising. The Supra to me felt very quickly like it was a car that had a lot of personality and that, crucially, it wanted to work with me as the driver. And that could be psychosomatic, but it really did feel like that. It felt like within only a couple of minutes of driving, it feels like you're not so much driving a car, it feels more like an extension of you, like you are part of the machine. And that is a very cool feeling, and not enough cars, especially these days, have that feeling anymore. And I think that's a cool thing to get right, and Toyota definitely did. They ticked every box. It's a great drag car, a great race car, a great drifter, a great street-tuned vehicle, and even great in its stock form. So even though I'm still not a Supra fanboy, I can confirm for both the lovers and the haters of the Supra, people who think it's underrated, overrated, and everywhere in between, that there is actually a lot to love about this car. And if you are considering one, maybe against the new one, I can't tell you which one to buy, but I can definitely say that this is a car which for the foreseeable future will, let's just say, most likely keep a lot of that value. And yes, you can use it every day. Fuel economy is over 20 to the gallon if you're sensible, under 20 to the gallon if you're not, and the performance is still very good by today's standards. This one with the auto, the manual even more so. It's a lot of fun. I was really impressed by the car, and I get it. I think it is a legend for a reason. Either way, I'll see you next time, and of course, if you are new to the channel and want to check out some of my other reviews, such as for the Astons, Maseratis, etc., then click right here on screen to see those. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.